Formula One has seen some over-the-limit racing in Mexico, and it seems like the drivers are now adamant that the behaviour of Verstappen should change, not from 2025, but from the next race onwards. Russell has spoken about this matter, and if reports are to be believed, the remainder of 2024 will see a massive clampdown of the defensive manoeuvres from Verstappen. But how will this reflect on the championship fight? And will it be a massive setback for the Dutchman, who relied a lot on these manoeuvres in order to keep his position? It goes without saying that Verstappen is one of the dirtiest yet on-limit drivers that we've seen in the sport, and that's been proven in Austin and Mexico. In Austin, Verstappen has respected the rule of being ahead of the apex in turn 1 and 12 on multiple occasions against Sainz and Norris, even though for the majority of these sequences, the rivals of Verstappen had to back off because it would ultimately mean that it would crash and risk a DNF. This was particularly seen in Mexico, with Verstappen's actions in turn 4 and 8 against Norris, especially in turn 8, where he sent the car on the outside and not only gained an advantage through it, but also pushed Norris out of it and gave Leclerc the opportunity to climb 2 positions without even trying, the same as he did in Austin. There was a briefing among the drivers after the Mexico GP and the duel of Verstappen and Norris, one that ended with a 20-second penalty for the 3-time world champion, or more precisely, 2 10-second penalties for pushing Norris off the track in turn 4 and overtaking and gaining advantage outside of the track in turn 8. While Horner and Marco labelled the penalties as harsh, 19 out of 20 drivers have said that the racing manoeuvres of Verstappen are way too harsh and they need to be changed immediately. When talking about it, the Mercedes driver said, "I think the stewards are totally on board with what needs to change. Our view is, I think the biggest discussion is they wanted to wait until 2025, so it's something consistent through this year." I would say 19 out of 20 drivers said, well, if it's correct, make the change today. I'm glad to see those incidents were punished, and I suspect moving forward in Brazil, what we saw in Mexico and what we saw in Austin, you won't be able to get away with. 19 out of 20. We're all aligned on where it needs to be. Well, I think you all know who the number 1 driver that hasn't agreed with this type of racing is. And while Verstappen admitted that he will follow the rulebook that he personally feels needs a lot of changing, he hasn't done anything outside of it in Austin. He just followed the rules. He was ahead of the apex, and the sole fact that he respected that rule meant that he was able to control the corner and the rival around him. But in Mexico, it was visible that Verstappen was not ahead of the apex in turn 4, and his actions against Norris were definitely unjustified. Not to mention that the turn 8 accident has almost ended the race of the McLaren driver for something that he was definitely not at fault. This is not a place where you can overtake, let alone send the car without any desire to make the corner whatsoever. Verstappen himself hasn't been too worried about the penalty and joked that the next time he receives a 20-second penalty, he'll likely have a drink in the car because it takes so long to count those 20 seconds while being stationary. However, what he said could concern Red Bull to a greater extent, as they've now lost a 2nd place in the Constructors' Championship with no intention of bringing it back whatsoever. And when talking about it to a greater extent, Verstappen said, "You know, honestly, 20 seconds is a lot, but I'm not going to cry about it. And I'm also not going to share my opinion. The biggest problem that I have is that today was a bad day in terms of race pace. That was quite clear again, on the mediums and on the hard tyres. I just felt that the turn 4 was a bit more of a question mark. Turn 7, it is what it is. And honestly, those 2 things are also not my problem. The problem is that we're too slow, and that's why I'm being put in those kind of positions. That was my problem." Now, Toto Wolff has been adamant about the rule change as well, saying that there is definitely a lot of change expected after the latest race in Mexico, and what we must praise is the consistency of the FIA and the fact that they wanted to make an example out of Verstappen. Just because he got away with his reckless driving in Austin, which was again under the rules, doesn't mean he'll get to implement them everywhere and potentially end his rivals' races, especially the ones who are threatening him for the Drivers' Championship. The steward in Mexico was Johnny Herbert, a known expert who's been feuding with Verstappen about the swearing scandal. But on the other hand, the steward in Austin was Derek Warwick, a man who has ownership in Honda, and we can raise a case about both of them being biased towards the respective teams they're related to. Nevertheless, Wolff is now adamant that such a change in the behaviour of the FIA will see a different approach from the drivers, especially from Max Verstappen. Furthermore, the team principal of Mercedes said, "A driver will always push to the limit, and when the rules or the interpretation of the rules allow a certain way of racing, a driver like Max is always going to exploit it." Now, there has been a new interpretation and execution of those regulations, and I think it will change the way everyone races in the future, and you won't see that anymore. I think the stewards today decided they don't want to see drivers pushing each other out of the track. That will be the new normality. All drivers will be very aware that if you do that, you risk a 5 or 10-second penalty. I think back in the day, certain stewards had their opinion, and because it wasn't penalised, it basically legitimated it. Fair enough to have a driver who drives within the regulations and utilises all the margins that are given to them by stewards. This is a very mature statement from Wolff because he has all the reasons to bash Verstappen for the way he drives. We've seen how he raced Hamilton back in 2021, and if we are to recall a certain event in Brazil, we would see an action that was more or less a replica of the 2024 Mexico GP's Turn 8 between Norris and Verstappen. Be that as it may, Helmut Marko feels like the penalties against Verstappen have been quite harsh, and the FIA has reacted emotionally because they still felt the impact from the Austin GP and the emotions that were running high from these two running in wheel-to-wheel combat. Elaborating further, the veteran Austrian said, "The penalties were very, very harsh. I think that was an overreaction to what happened in Austin. You have 5 seconds and you have 10 seconds, but now we had twice 10 seconds, and I think that was very harsh." Now, obviously, there is a logical explanation as to why the FIA gave a 10-second penalty for the first incident at Turn 4 because Verstappen forced Norris off the track while not being ahead at the apex, even though Horner has presented the telemetry to the stewards and noted that the Brit has entered the apex with 15 km faster speed than usual, hinting that he wouldn't have made the corner nevertheless of Verstappen's behaviour. But to add to this extent, Norris was exiting out of a DRS zone with an open flap, and obviously he had the audacity to brake later in order to be ahead of Verstappen, which is something that the Dutchman has done himself, and this time the McLaren driver feels like his fiercest rival has been served for what he's been serving to the grid for quite some time. When talking about the battle against Verstappen in Mexico, Norris didn't hold back on words, stating that Verstappen received exactly what he was supposed to, a taste of his own medicine, further stating, "I go into every race expecting a tough battle with Max. It's clear, it doesn't matter if he wins or finishes second, his only job is to beat me in the race. He'll sacrifice himself to do that, like he did today. I want to have those tough battles, like I've seen him have plenty of times, but fair ones. It's always going to be tough with Max. He's never going to make anyone's life easy, especially mine at this point of the year. But I think today was not fair, clean racing. Therefore, I think he got what he had coming to him. Today, I felt like I had to avoid collisions, and that's not what you feel like you want to do in a race. He's in a very powerful position in the championship. He's a long way ahead and he has nothing to lose. People can say it's the other way around, like he's got everything to lose and it's all for me, but it's not the case. Well, with all this in mind, do you think that the FIA's change of attitude towards Verstappen and his actions of defending are justified? And more importantly, do you think that the 3-time world champion will see himself changing the way he approaches duels with Leclerc and Norris in the last 4 races of the season? Let us know in the comments down below.